Dear all, welcome to this Fireside chat on sustainability. My name is Annemarie Manger. I'm Director of Sustainability for Tata Steel Europe, and I will be following on with the conversation with Paul Polman. Thank you, Paul, for your remarks. You often emphasize that the business has an important role to play, together with governments and other organizations to solve the world's problems. You've shown some personal leadership, already starting in 2014-15, establishing the Sustainable Development Goals. Can you share a bit about that experience and how the world has changed since then?
Well, yes, and good morning, everybody, or good afternoon, whatever part of the world you're in. And thank you, Annemarie, for this opportunity. The first thing to do would be to congratulate you. I always, before I do these talks, read a little bit about the companies, which makes it interesting. And I just saw that you won the Steely Award for Excellence in Sustainability for all the work you're doing to go to zero carbon in logistics. And that's a very important thing. I was also pleased to see the announcement that you made just a few weeks ago on really getting to net zero by 2050. This is a high abatement industry that is not easy. I don't envy you guys. And yet you know what is needed. And in typical Tata style, you go after setting the right objectives, which is net zero and moving to hydrogen. And hopefully technology will develop there at the speed that we need it. But I applaud you for your courage, including many other parts of your organization. The Sustainable Development Goals really are very important. When we started with Kofi Annan in the year 2000, the Millennial Development Goals, which had as objective to halve the number of people in poverty. At that time, it was defined as $1.25 a day. We put this 15-year plan out there that was mainly focused on the developing markets. And frankly, the issues that were described in the Millennial Development Goals were really the issues of that time, the HIV, the development aid, and very few attention was paid on to business or to partnerships. It was an afterthought that became goal 8 in the Millennial Development Goals. In the 15 years, we actually achieved the objective of halving the number of people in poverty. Obviously, China has been a big part of that, but also in other parts of the world where we have had an incredible wealth creation and can be proud of that. So when we met in Rio Plus 20, which was in 2012 in Rio, it was very clear that we could not stop halfway and that we had to finish the job. At that time, the countries like Brazil and Colombia sponsored an initiative that then became the Sustainable Development Goals. And Ban Ki-moon, who was the Secretary General at that time, had the courage to establish a panel of 27, what he called highly eminent people, which were mainly heads of state. Head of state of Indonesia, Mr. Yudhoyono, or David Cameron from the UK, Alan Sirleaf from Liberia, and some former heads of states from other major countries included. But he also had the courage to include the private sector. He understood very well that these Sustainable Development Goals could not be achieved without the private sector. Just to put it in perspective, they require about $3 to $5 trillion a year of spending to implement. Overseas development aid by all the governments is only 160 billion. So without innovation like you are doing, without the financial capital, the human resources, the ingenuity, the global reach of businesses, if you want to, we would never be able to develop these Sustainable Development Goals. In 2012, when we started the work and spent about 2 years on that, listening to all parts of society, different people from different parts of the world, the farmers community, the people with disability, the women organizations, business itself, and many other constituents, if you want to, we developed, in fact, these Sustainable Development Goals that have now become a beacon or a guideline for everybody. And we were very pleased, with tears in our eyes, may I say, when they got signed in 2015 in September in the United Nations. And only a few months later, goal number 13, which is climate mitigation, was approved in Paris with this wonderful Paris Agreement. So that was an incredible year, 2015. Unfortunately, what we've seen in politics is by not addressing some of these major problems, many people have not seen progress. Many people have increased angst towards climate change, their jobs, inequality that has crept back into society. And this is exactly what the Sustainable Development Goals need to address. The challenge now is that governments are incredibly bifurcated, that multilateralism isn't quite working the way we had designed it. And many issues are now appearing, or cracks, if you want to, in that system that make it incredibly difficult to work together on these challenges of the pandemic, of the financial markets, of the climate change, which really have become global challenges itself. That's why we're so fortunate that we have this moral framework or the Sustainable Development Goals, because it serves as a beacon now for many others. And with governments being in a difficult situation, it is very important that the private sector steps up. Business obviously has discovered that it cannot succeed in failing societies, but it also knows that it cannot be a bystander in a system that gives it life in the first place. And what we increasingly see is that responsible business is integrating these sustainable development goals into their business strategies. In fact, they're making it their business strategies, and for a very good reason. I established a commission that I asked Mark Malloch-Brown to chair a few years ago, which was the Business and Sustainable Development Commission. And we found very simply that in these 10 years, until 2030, just implementing these sustainable development goals would unlock an additional $12 trillion of economic opportunity and create 380 million jobs. And that was before COVID. What we've all now known is that since COVID, these opportunities have only increased further. So an incredible beacon. And it's not surprising to see that of the Global Compact members, the UN Global Compact, which I chair for the Secretary General, we've not only seen our membership increase to 17,000 organizations since COVID, but also 90% of these organizations use the Sustainable Development Goals, for which I proudly wear this pin, if you might
I noticed.
recall, to implement this to be successful in their strategies.
Thank you, Paul. So you mentioned the Sustainable Development Goals as the important framework. I think you've launched another important framework with your Net Positive launch. So there will be a lot of listeners currently thinking, how do I start with embedding Net Positive into my company? Maybe you can give some hints. Where should we start, if not already?
No, it's good. What Net Positive is all about, how companies can profit by solving the world's problems, not by creating the world's problems. It asks the simple question that, is your world better off? Is the world better off because you, with your company, is in it or not? And that is for each to answer. The book is very light on the why we need to change. It is very clear to most people what the challenges are that we have, most notably climate change and inequality. So the book indeed focuses on how. It's not an autobiography or a aren't we good story from Unilever. It is really the best practices that we could find globally, sharing our experiences to indeed help other companies on that journey, because it isn't an easy journey in the first place. Just to remember that this year, 2021, Earth's Overshoot Day was July 29th, which is actually the day that we use up more resources than the world can replenish. I always express it slightly differently. After that day, each day more, we're actually stealing from future generations. So many companies are in the CSR territory, Annemarie, and you know that well, the corporate social responsibility. But CSR is really dealing with being less bad. In a world that already has overshot its planetary boundaries by such a magnitude, less bad is simply not good enough anymore. It is saying, I used to murder 10 people, now I'm only murdering 5 people, so I'm a better murderer. It just doesn't work anymore. So many companies are starting to understand that, and many of the CEOs are saying, okay, then I need to be sustainable. And that is very noble. But sustainable is neither good nor bad. It's being neutral. We know that many people still need to come out of poverty. We know that there is economic growth that is putting an imprint on this society. Just being neutral when you have already these negative feedback loops coming in many areas is not good enough anymore either. So what the book talks about is that responsible companies understand that they need to think regenerative, restorative, reparative. And that is what we call net positive. And the main thing how to start there is to take responsibility of your total impact in the world, intended consequences as well as non-intended consequences. Many companies still outsource their value chain and also think that by doing so, they can outsource their responsibilities. That doesn't work anymore. So the first step is to take total responsibility. The second step is to find your purpose. And that you need to find with all your people. Like you cannot have a sustainable company if you're not sustainable yourself. You cannot have a purpose-driven company if you're not purposeful yourself. Obviously, Tata, with its foundation, its way of working, its founders, it has an incredible purpose and has always seen its role as strengthening the communities in which it operates, working with the multiple stakeholders, and having that broader social responsibility. Then you have to set targets. If you don't set targets, and targets you can measure and hold people accountable, report on them, then it doesn't work. Once you've done that, then you make your game plans and they become very quickly transparent. There's a lot of things out there that can help you to get going, from efforts that we're doing at the UN Global Compact or the International Chamber of Commerce or other trade associations you might belong to. And then finally, you discover that for many of the bigger challenges that you need to crack, you need to work with other people. First in your value chain, then in your industry itself, moving the competitive field and doing more things together when it gets to issues that concern the future of humanity. And finally, for the tougher transformations, we as companies need to step up in our partnership with other parts of civil society, ultimately with governments, to de-risk the political process and to ensure that we get the right rules, laws, regulations, frameworks, whatever you want to call it, to really drive these true system changes. So these are the hallmarks of a net positive company, if you want to. Overall responsibility of your total handprint in society, multi-stakeholder longer-term models, shareholder return, a result of what you do, not an objective, and participating in these broader transformations to drive the systems changes.
Paul, you obviously are well aware of the Tata background and the company where Jamshedji Tata once said, indeed, the community is the part of the purpose and not just a stakeholder. So that is very much in our values. So about partnerships in the supply chain, I know you've done a lot of work on that, partnering with other companies in the supply chain, with NGOs. Maybe you can give a bit of light on that. What are the main system changes that you think are needed?
Yeah, the most important system changes, in fact, if I may be honest, is between these two little things. It's in here. It's ourselves. You know, are we willing to take responsibility of our total impact, of the consequences of us being here? Just like human beings, businesses need to do that as well. And many businesses, unfortunately, still are abdicating these responsibilities and have incredible negative externalities in their business models. And increasingly, society is catching up on that as it becomes more visible. Governments are catching up on that. The European Green Deal, the taxonomy, the border tax adjustments are all examples of ensuring that these externalities get reflected on the balance sheet of companies. We call it the extended producer responsibility, if you want to. So companies will increasingly have to internalize these challenges. And what you then see is, not surprisingly, is that companies that actively or proactively do that are actually in a better position for being successful in the future, but are also increasingly more valued by the financial market. We've looked at about 3,000 companies and looked at their negative externalities. If they would have to pay for that, a quarter of these companies would not make any money at all. So that's a big problem. But here is the interesting thing. The companies actually that were more actively fighting these negative externalities, which we often hear cost more money and the shareholder doesn't want it and it's difficult to do. But within an industry, if you take the steel industry or shipping or forestry or the food industry, within an industry we can compare, and we see actually that the companies that are more proactively mitigating these negative externalities, actually are also valued higher by the financial market. So that really tells you that these things are not anymore immaterial, that they are becoming very, very material. So some of these bigger challenges then that you need to face, like how do you get plastic out of the oceans? How do you stop deforestation? How do you move to regenerative agriculture? How can the whole steel industry be carbon neutral or carbon positive, if you want to, in that thinking? Requires partnerships at the highest level. Partnerships with civil society, partnerships with academics, partnerships with other actors in the industry or in your value chain, and ultimately with governments as well. You take the issue of hydrogen and the bold commitment that you have made to go to green hydrogen and make steel carbon neutral, if you want to. Increasingly, the industry is understanding that in order to get there, we need some major investments and some major technological breakthroughs. And the same is true for other sectors. Fertilizers is looking at hydrogen. Companies like Yara, shipping is looking at hydrogen. You might even discover that if you actively work it, that there are many other business opportunities opening up, and that you might even pivot from being a steel supplier to an energy supplier because you have the right energy. But these things need to be worked collectively. And this is also where the governments come in. Right now, we have probably 500 billion of perforce subsidies that actually push industries in the wrong direction when it comes to the energy transformation. We have governments that, including the Dutch government, that are not making the commitments to really be in line with the Paris agreements, that are now being forced by courts or by civil society and increasingly by business to step up. So when you have these bigger challenges, it requires all of us to make these transitions. What we are now finding out is that if we share the risks, if we share these investments, if we share the knowledge on these important transformations, then actually the cost that we need to put behind that to make these transitions is actually much cheaper than what we would pay by not moving forward. The climate change is on a 3% trajectory still today. The combined submissions to the COP26 that I'm there in 2 weeks' time still show a 16% increase in the next 10 years by the submissions by the governments, when we need a 45% decline. So this is a point actually that if we don't act, we risk that our GDP, our growth, gets adjusted downwards by 10%. So the small investments, big as it may seem to some, of the 1 or 2% of our GDP right now in stimulating these broader partnerships, it's actually trivial compared to what we increasingly are paying for stopping our, for having our failures. At Unilever, I actually spent the last 5 years in my 10-year tenure. The first 5 years was really spent getting Unilever back on track and making the company successful and making our own house in order. You can't get a seat at the table if you are not, walking the talk. This is not a preaching business. We've prayed long enough and haven't seen the difference. So this is an action business. So you need to really get that credibility. But then the last 5 years I entirely spent on forging these broader partnerships to get out of deforestation, where you see Indonesia having come down rapidly in the rate of deforestation, to get to sustainable sourcing in the value chains and forming these broader coalitions. And anytime we did that, we found that we could move faster, that we could set bigger objectives, and that actually we were better off. Over the 10 years, Unilever had a 300% shareholder return and 19% return on invested capital. The shareholders also increasingly understood that it was better for them as well. But it's hard and it takes courage, because you have to work with other people. You're not totally in charge. You might have to set targets you don't feel yet totally comfortable with. And all these things take courage. So the biggest system change, therefore, is in fact, and I want to come back to that, in our own minds, our own leadership, our own courage.
Thank you. Your plea to take responsibility is a clear one. Huh? So in fact, you even have a chapter that tells us to embrace the elephant and not to avoid it. And I think we have a clear line of sight on the energy partnerships, where we need to think about upstream on how the system will change. Maybe you can give us and the audience a bit of guidance of where the steel industry and their customers can also form an alliance in a way to contribute.
Yeah, so what the book talks about in Elephants in the Room, which is actually a very interesting chapter, and we're getting a lot of feedback on that, is that if you go on this journey, you need to be consistent. What we see is that many businesses want to change, but they're not consistent. I give you a direct and very simple example. The Biden administration now has a reconciliation package there that they want to push through of $3.5 trillion investment in infrastructure. Absolutely crucial. And that is infrastructure in all the senses. But it also has a tax adjustment in there to go back to the old tax rate that was there before the Trump administration. So we see many of the big companies making incredible commitments to be carbon neutral, or even in the case of Microsoft, let's say, to be carbon positive by going back to 1975. But then at the same time, we see the trade associations that these companies belong to lobbying to stop these laws from being passed because there's a small tax increase. So what the elephants in the room talk about is, how do you deal with CEO salary? How do you deal with corruption? How do you deal with money in politics? How do you deal with human rights? How do you deal with trade associations that continue to advocate different things than what you believe you stand for? The most important systems change that we now need, next to the leadership I talked about, is obviously to tackle climate change. This is the most burning and existential issue that we have, if we like it or not. And the science has spoken. I don't really have to talk too much about it anymore. So when these trade associations really fight climate change, I'm going out. At Unilever, when I was in charge, we went out of ELAC in the US, the Chamber of Commerce in the US. In Europe, we went out of some of the trade associations because they simply weren't aligned with our values. And what the employees saw then was, well, that's indeed, we are consistent. Management or the leaders are serious about this. We don't just say one thing and do another thing. So closing that say-do gap is important. Now the steel industry. The steel industry is very well positioned because in the coming 10 years, we're going to spend about $90 trillion on infrastructure, $6 trillion a year. And how we are going to spend that and how we are going to do that is in fact decisive for the future of humanity. If I take London, where I'm calling from right now, the road systems that were laid there by the Romans. So, and they're still the road systems that we use right now. Once you lock in an infrastructure, then you're tight. Most of the 1/3 or to half of that is in the emerging markets, where we obviously have this population growth still going on, this urbanization going on, and frankly, the economic growth that needs to happen. So it's very important that whatever part of the infrastructure industry you're in, which is a very broad definition, but you're definitely part of that, that we do this sustainably. Because the carbon budget that we have is probably about 10 to 15 years left. If you talk about 500 gigatons, if you want to stay below 1.5 degrees, this is just in infrastructure alone, which is most likely going to double over the next few decades. You would overshoot that budget by an incredible amount if you would not go green. So you have it in your hands, frankly, where about 90% of the issues are in these difficult high abatement sectors, to decide what future we want. And frankly, we don't have a choice in this. So this is an industry that has to collaborate. This is an industry that has to set more audacious, sometimes uncomfortable targets. That is an industry that needs to actively work with all partners, including governments, to move the frameworks forward. The companies within the industries that are trying to hold themselves back from this journey, I think, are putting themselves on a very dangerous path that can only lead to the graveyard of dinosaurs. And we see some of that happening, frankly, if I may say, in my direct Dutch style, in some of the fossil fuel industries, where there's a clear bifurcation now between the Ørsteds or even the Totals or the Iberdrolas that are actually, or the Enels that are actively leading these transitions, and the Exxons or Chevrons or some others that are actually trailing.
So there's a huge challenge for all of us to build back better. And I think realizing the magnitude of that change will be indeed daunting or uncomfortable for the leaders of the companies. So what's the big tip, the big lesson for us to deal with that?
Well, we have to build back better. We missed the opportunity during the financial crisis when, frankly, we didn't spend on right sizing or greening the global economy. At that time, people felt banks were too big to fail, but people were too small to matter. By not addressing it in the preceding 10 years, we saw the dissatisfaction, people in the streets expressing their dissatisfaction at the polls. We elected quite a lot of political leaders of stature that we've never seen before. Nationalism, populism, xenophobia crept back. We made things worse. And actually, COVID is a direct result of that. The destruction of biodiversity gives you these zoonotic diseases, SARS, Ebola, Zika, Asian flu, now a particularly nasty one with COVID. So this is more than a warning sign. The good thing about COVID is that we have discovered in COVID that by spending $17 trillion already to save lives and livelihoods, by losing about $26, $27 trillion in economic growth over this decade, according to the IMF, we've now discovered, first and foremost, that there are no healthy people on an unhealthy planet, but we've also discovered that the cost of our inactions are significantly higher than the cost of our actions. So not surprisingly now, governments, businesses, and others are accelerating. When COVID started, the overwhelming belief of the cynics and skeptics, of which we have enough in this world, was that business would go back to cost cutting and laying off people, and that ESG would be on the back burner. Nothing could be farther from the truth. We've actually seen an absolute step change in the other direction. Before COVID, we had 21 countries making a commitment to be net zero by 2050. We now have 131 countries making a commitment to be net zero by 2050. From 30% of the global emissions, now 70% is covered. That's an unimaginable step change that we've seen in this year and a half's time during COVID. From companies, we had nearly less than 1 or 2% of companies making net zero commitments. Now 20% of the biggest companies, including the tougher industries like yourself, are making these commitments. But here's the interesting thing. The financial market, not known for its moral standards to drive change, but is actually incredibly actively jumping on this. ESG investments have gone through the roof. In fact, people estimate that they will be $50 trillion by 2025. We now have $90 trillion of money in a Glasgow alliance we've put together to ask for net zero with their money under management, $90 trillion. So things are moving, and things are moving more than people are making you believe. Unfortunately, there are two things that need to happen. We need to act now. Between now and 2030 is going to be very key. This is an accumulation of CO2. You cannot wait for the last day and then repair it. So the few companies and governments have specific roadmaps and plans for between now and 2030. And the second thing is that even with these combined ambitions that I just mentioned, the total targets that we are committing to is not enough versus what we need. So we need to step up ambition, and we need to accelerate the timeline. And this is where building back better comes in. The money that needs to be spent in these global economies right now, the plans that have been agreed behind that are tremendous. And it is actually healthy to see that it is the business community now that is actively advocating with governments to ensure that that spending goes to this greener, more resilient, more job creating in the economy of the future versus the brown, nature destroying, job destroying, actually, climate polluting, air polluting, brown industry of the past. And there the jury is still out. Although we have seen a significant shift, 2% in the financial crisis, now 15% deliberately behind green recovery, Europe setting the pace, we still have a lot more to do. So that's where Europe probably will become the trendsetter with border tax adjustments, with their biodiversity package, their circular economy package, with the taxonomy setting standards for ESG. I think increasingly you will see that. But we cannot solve it. We cannot solve it if we don't have the bigger countries like China or India or Brazil or Mexico also making the commitments. And unfortunately, as I sit here today, 2 weeks before COP, that hasn't happened yet.
So still a lot to do. It's a complex subject, but I don't think I need to ask my last question, which were whether you were optimistic or pessimistic, because I think your whole book has a radiance of optimism, and that's what I really like about it, to actually focus on the how and how to get there.
Well, what is true is that an optimist and a pessimist have the same life, but an optimist, I always believe, has a little bit of a happier life. All the pessimist tracks, even if that gets into your mind sometimes when we feel down or sorry about ourselves, doesn't lead to anything. I'm actually a prisoner of hope. I believe that technology always surprises us on the positive. We've seen that with the price of green energy. So technology, don't underestimate that. We're also at the point where the cost of action is lower than the cost of inaction, which makes it very attractive, even for the Milton Friedman lovers. This is a very good economic case. And then we see the next generation coming up, which gives me incredible hope. If you listen to the young, which increasingly are in charge, the millennials and Generation Z, their voices are increasingly being heard. We should include them in all the plans we do. They want the changes. There's a whole wave coming in of your future consumers or customers, if you want to, that you'd better be ready to. And then the financial market is moving. We have to give them a little bit of credit. When the financial market is moving at this scale, I can only tell you there must be something going on. So you don't want to miss the boat once more. And that's why we have to do this. We can only do it if we do it all together. You're in a wonderful position to do that as an industry leader. You're also in a wonderful position to do that, to get do that together with all your suppliers and people in your value chain to get that critical mass. And ultimately, we need to step up to also help the governments have that courage. And with our collective voices and advocacy and showing by example that it's possible, we hopefully can move at the speed and scale that is needed to save humanity.
Excellent, Paul. We will make sure to get a copy of your book to all of our customers listening in today, and to spread the optimism and the hope. It was great talking to you, and I hope you can get on with your work, busy times for COP26, and hopefully we'll get a good result out of that. Thank you very much.
Thanks for the opportunity, Annemarie, and thanks for all what you're doing. Hope to see you soon.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.